important members of the Forum Committee. You might wonder how we get these, thank you, how we're able to get people like this. Actually, MSNBC, Fox News are very jealous this afternoon because this is the caliber of guests that they are lucky, but they never get them both at the same time. So we're running well today. I'd like to thank Joyce Skalbeck for all the notes that she gave me on these wonderful speakers. And one of our speakers, Steve Maviglio, who is the son of Dolores Eitel, and one of the reasons that we have them here, has been on 10, he's been on 14 different best 100 lists in the United States. But listen, the most important one, he's been #1 on her list forever and ever and ever. I think I'm actually going to scrap these notes because we want to hear them. But what's really important is they're both political consultants. They have their own companies. One is trying to retire, but people say, we don't think he's going to make it to Puglio or up to his cabin in the Sierras because he's still involved within his heart and his spirit. So both of them are nationally, internationally known. And let's just welcome Steve and Rob this afternoon.
Thank you. Sometimes I do wonder if I'm #1 on the list with my mom, but most of the times, yes. Thank you for coming. I think this is my 5th time doing this. I always have to scrounge to find a Republican, but Rob has been good enough to do this a couple times in a row now. So
Steve has the goods on me. I don't have a choice.
Yeah, but we're both protected by the Endangered Species Act. I'm a moderate Democrat and he's a moderate Republican. So here we are. And we're going to run through these in semi-rapid fashion because there's 10 of them. There's a lot. There's going to be a lot on the slides. So read those. And we'll try to give you a little bit beyond what you see in the minute specials they have on these on TV, who put them on, who's spending the money on them, what the polling is right now. And just to give you a little more emphasis on some of the smaller pieces that you see on the evening news. So any opening remarks from you there?
Just it's good to be here with all of you. I've had the honor to do this twice, at least twice, I think, with Steve before, but it was always virtual. So it's good to be back in a room full of people who are engaged in their citizenship and eager to learn before casting ballots. So thank you for having me.
Okay, so off we go. Turn it on. I'll be like Trump and stand here for 30 minutes. Just click the wheel. Okay, so let's start out by asking why we have so many ballot initiatives this year. Well, this is something that I can blame my party largely for. When it's a presidential year, the Democrats in the legislature like to put a lot of things on the ballot that attract voters to vote for their candidate. And it's the dynamic of the voter is a more liberal voter, a younger voter, a less income voter, tend to be more Democratic. So they like to put things on the ballot that get people to the polls and also increase their chances of passing because they're more progressive initiatives. There are 10, as I said, a little more than we had last year, but you might notice the advertising on TV is a little bit less. Some of these are less contentious than we had in the past. We have one that we'll talk about that's on for the 3rd time. Fortunately, there's nothing about kidney dialysis this year. But still, you'll be seeing lots of ads if you haven't already. The good news is that there's at least 3 that didn't make it to the ballot, Rob.
Yeah, there's a reform that took place 10 or 12 years ago when Mayor Steinberg was in the Senate and the pro tem. He ushered through a reform that actually allows proponents, once they've qualified a measure, to be able to withdraw it. usually the deadline for that is about June of the election year. And what that's done is it has set up it has set the table, excuse me, for negotiations on some issues. So there were a few measures this year that negotiated away. There was a referendum on a law on setbacks for oil wells. There was a private attorney general action. So basically businesses trying to change state law so they weren't subject to as many frivolous lawsuits. That was called PAGA reform. All those things negotiated off of the ballot. So it's a reform that's been pretty efficient in getting some issues dealt with where maybe people think they should be, which is the legislature.
And there's so many that actually never even make the ballot. A lot of people take out the papers to do this as a threat legislatively. We're going to put something on the ballot if you don't pass this law. And we saw a lot of that this year too. Okay, so 5 of these got here, not by the people standing outside of Target begging for your signature, which, by the way, they get anywhere from 3 to 6 to, I think, some top 15 for your signature. Very valuable. And 5 of them were put on by the legislature. It requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature to put something on the ballot. Not too hard when the Democrats have that super majority, but in the past it used to be. So you'll see, we'll mention which ones are, so you know which ones are which. The other ones, it's costing, what's it costing now to put something on the ballot?
I think 9 million.
Yeah,
Yeah. If it's
just to get it on the ballot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Never mind passing it. Okay, I'm making it brighter. Frank. Sorry. Just pressing the button. Really hard, I guess. Okay, use the wheel. Okay. Okay, so in addition to the brilliance that we'll offer you today, there's several other things you can do to bone up on these. The first thing you should do is really pay attention to this. This is the only non-propaganda you're going to get in the mail. And it gives each side of every ballot equation the opportunity to make their best case. You can actually read the whole damn thing too, if you want. It's in the book. I don't recommend it because it's mostly legal beagle stuff. The other thing is this is the FPPC, which is our state political spending watchdog, compiles a list of the top 10 contributors to each ballot. So if you really want to know where the money is behind these things, take a look at that because that's a very good guide. The LAO, which is the Legislative Analyst, another nonpartisan organization, they scrutinize each one of these and talk in depth about the impact on the state budget, which, since we have a multi-billion-dollar deficit, seems to be very important these days. Read that. And one thing is, forget the polling. When people are asked about these things, they literally have no idea in most cases because they're complex. They haven't heard enough about them. And so they're going on a gut by just reading what a pollster says. So forget about that. Read your guide and really study up. Why don't you take a turn at this?
Wait, try it. Just go with the wheel.
I'm a Mac guy.
I went the wrong way though. You're going the wrong way. There we go.
Okay. So several of these, 3, I think, have to do that are bond related. And bonds are very interesting things because they tend to be in the billions of dollars these days. And it's the main way that the state actually pays for some of its biggest capital improvements, infrastructure, you name it. If it's a big price tag, they can't afford to do it year after year. So they make these bonds and they tend to be pretty colossal. The record on these has been pretty good, except for the last couple of years when voters have been paying a little more attention to the budget and saying, maybe we can't afford another 10 billion for this or that. The big surprise in the last election was Prop 1, the mental health bond that the governor really thought was going to pass with ease, and it squeaked by, literally, I think 1% passage. And that was something that almost everybody in all the polls said was going to overwhelmingly fly through, and it didn't. The payments from the bonds come through bonds that are sold to people like you and me. And so when something says this will cost $10 billion, add another 10% to that because that's the interest cost. So think about that when we're looking at some of the bonds on the ballot.
So let's start with the first bond that's on the ballot. It's the type of bond that has historically had the best chance of passing. It's an education bond, school bond. This one is for $10 billion, as you can see there. Of course, it goes to new facilities, but also improves existing facilities. This is not noted here on the slide, but the way this works now in the state is there has to be matching local money. So when there's a local bond, if you live somewhere where you're voting on a local bond, it is usually to then leverage money coming from a state bond like this. So the legislative analyst, of course, 10 billion to borrow. That's 500 million per year for 35 years. So you think, well, 35 years, but it's infrastructure. So think of it as a mortgage on a house that you're going to keep for 35 years. Payment does come from the general fund, directly funded by taxpayers. And right now we have 31.8 billion in bond funding over the past 20 years. So the arguments for this, well, they're going to argue the schools need them. They're going to argue this will make schools safer. Some of that has to do with the way, unfortunately, schools are being designed or redesigned in the era of greater threats to campuses. Some of this will be technology upgrades. You have wildfire, earthquake, and natural disaster relief that will be contingent inside this bond. And of course, as with any bond to try to sell it to the taxpayers, there is audits, accountability, et cetera. That'll be part of it. So the argument against is pretty straightforward. It's a lot of interest and it comes out of the general fund. We already have existing bonded debt. Money we should just be paying for this out of general fund instead of going into debt to pay for these improvements to schools. This one's interesting. As with California now as a contracting population, we are in an era of declining enrollment. So there's an expectation of actually fewer students. So do we really need to be building more into our schools? And that the voters rejected a similar bond back in 2020. Now it's interesting. What's different about that bond in 2020? It was larger. It was 15 billion. This one's 10 billion. So one of the tricks that people like Steve and I do is when we prepare these things, we do a lot of research and really try to find that threshold of, well, what's the tolerance level of what the voters are willing to accept? And we have a very direct data point from 2020, which is that, well, 15 billion was a little too much. So this year, that's one of the reasons they arrived at 10 billion. Who's in support of this? Interesting. It's bipartisan support, right? Democrats and Republicans are for it. The governor's for it. Of course, the teachers union is for it. Labor, but right there with Chamber of Commerce. So business and labor are for this. Republicans and Democrat parties are for this. And you say, well, what brings the Chamber and the Republicans to this? Because it's spending. Well, generally, particularly in the case of the Chamber, they want to support education, but one of the biggest contributors, if you go look at the top 10 contributors, like what Steve was talking about, you will find home builders. Home builders cannot build into new developments until schools can be paid for to be built at the same time as that new housing. So when we don't have enough money for new schools, it constricts new housing supply. So home builders are one of the big backers behind it, and that helps the reason that there be GOP support as well as Chamber of Commerce. And the opponents are about what you think. Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association is going to always reliably oppose any type of new debt like this. And then you have Southern California Newspaper Group is one of the more conservative, probably the most conservative editorial board across several papers. They print their editorials. And the Mercury News, I haven't read their editorial, but obviously they have a problem with it. Well, we know who wrote it. Yeah, our friend Dan Bornstein. Yeah. Well, actually, do we want to do questions at the end or questions after each one or at the end? Okay, next bond.
Okay, here we got another one. This one is about climate. Climate is a big umbrella in the legislature. It was put on by the legislature, 2/3 vote. Includes water, fire prevention, coastal protection, clean energy, parks. Merry Christmas, because this has something for everyone in it. The cost is, as we talked about, over 40 years, it's going to be $400 million per year. And the funding goes not just to government projects, but also to a lot of nonprofits and organizations, which is kind of interesting in itself because it's not a direct governmental expenditure. See if I can do this.
Down.
Down.
Yeah.
Okay. Did I miss one?
Nope.
No. Okay. Okay. So as you might expect, climate change is a huge issue for most Californians and most elected leaders, except a certain presidential candidate. And so they say we have to spend a lot of money on this right now. And by a lot, we mean not what can be in the typical California state budget, particularly when there's a deficit. We have increasing problems in the state. No secret, if you managed to spend the last few weeks with your air conditioner off, God bless you, because it's been hotter than ever and it's going to get hotter than ever. So a lot of this funding is going to climate related projects to stop that from happening. Down. So the opponents to this, which is not a very organized lot, by the way, say this really fails the test for a bond, that the money that's going toward this should come out of the state budget. It shouldn't be a bond for like a school or highways or some of those bigger ticket items. And the only reason this is on the ballot is because we have a budget deficit. That's their argument. This was actually a much larger price tag. There was a larger price tag on this, and they got negotiated down for the very reason that Rob talked about. They did polling. People weren't buying it when it was a big number, so it's gone down a little bit. Still, it made the ballot 2/3 vote. Down. Okay, the supporters are who you might expect. Most of the environmental groups, labor, because there's a lot of jobs that come along with a lot of these projects, particularly some of the energy ones. League of Women Voters, which now takes positions on ballot arguments. We have a lot of utilities involved because they're going to be getting a lot of the money to make their energy supplies cleaner. And newspapers is just about what you might expect. The B is on record for yes, the Chronicle's there. Most of the papers in the state are on board with this. I'm going to get this sooner or later. Okay. The no campaign, largely Republicans, taxpayers organizations, some of the more conservative newspapers in the state. Okay. Going to get off bonds for a second and go to something completely different. And this is Prop 3, which would enshrine the right to marriage for anybody, regardless of their race or sexual identification, into the Constitution. Now you say, well, it's already legal. Why do we need this? Well, because about a decade ago, we had Prop 8, which was another ballot initiative that made it illegal. But since that time, the Supreme Court has ruled that it is legal. Follow the bouncing ball on this issue. But, you know, attitudes have changed on this across America. But the reason it's on the ballot is because we still have the old law in our Constitution. So people want to change that to bring it up to where most people are thinking these days. And there's also a fear that the Supreme Court that we have now might reverse this if given the opportunity. So that's the reason it's on the ballot. It was put here by the legislature, overwhelming vote, Republicans and Democrats for this one. And there's really no strong opposition this time, oddly enough. When Prop 8 was on the ballot, it was a bitter fight. This time, not so much. As we said, as I just said before, here are the reasons for it. Again, just updating our California Constitution. This is one of the smallest ballot initiatives. I think it's only a few sentences long, so it's very easy to figure out. Again, repeals Prop 8, removes that language. And I'm going backwards once again. Someday I'll get this. So the people against this, they're really not banging on that same arguments that you use with
There's both of them right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know, if you read what's in the ballot book, it's, you know, I'm supposed to be arbitrary about this, but it's a pretty lame argument, not for nothing. So there you have it. Down, right? Okay, so supporters are who you might think. Governor, the Democrats, the Labor Fed. Where are the Republicans on this? Are they?
I don't think the party took a position, but obviously, as you noted, there were a lot of Republican votes in the legislature for it, or a fair number. Yeah.
Yeah. So there you have that. There they are, very lonely, but they're there. Okay, back.
All right, back to finances. Back to money. So Proposition 5 is interesting. So what this does, this will be a constitutional amendment. Right now, the state constitution requires a 2/3 vote to pass anything that would increase property taxes. So local bonds, any type of assessment on parcels requires a 2/3 vote. There is interest in some to want to lower that threshold to make it easier to pass these types of finance mechanisms at the local level. So Prop 5, as you can see, lowers it down to 55%. Most of these bonds are typically used for infrastructure, particularly transportation. Fire protection is now becoming a relevant use of them, sometimes affordable housing and water projects. The net effect of this, according to LAO, is that, well, you're going to have more local bonds passed. So they are projecting that there will be some type of increase that would cost taxpayers, property owners on their tax bills, a couple of $2 billion. So the arguments against it as well, 2/3 is undemocratic. Whatever happened to majority vote? We have a housing crisis that needs this type of financing. Did I say against? The slide's correct. I misspoke. Thank you for paying attention. These are obviously the arguments for. The list includes first-time homebuyer programs, that we're trying to get going in a lot of local communities, and provides more flexibility for local priorities. Now the arguments against. Easier passage is going to mean higher property taxes. It will make California less affordable, opponents argue. The definition of infrastructure in the proponents' arguments, they say, is a bit vague, meaning it could be about anything. And includes a retroactive provision for this November's bonds. So that might get tested by the courts, I would think. But so bonds that are on the ballot now, whether they actually pass or not, we may not know in your locality until you see the outcome of Prop 5. I'll say one more argument against this that I know is common is that the 2/3 threshold exists and not just simple majority because the tax is not on everybody, but on property owners, on homeowners. Here are the supporters. Not any surprises there. California Democratic Party is endorsed. You have labor, who would benefit from more spending on a lot of these projects. The YIMBY, this is the Yes in My Backyard coalition, which has become a much bigger thing. Sounds like there's I may have struck a nerve with YIMBY. And the no's, familiar suspects there. Although you notice the chamber, which we've already demonstrated in some of the earlier positions, are willing to be like they were for the education bond. This is something that they are concerned about and opposed, as well as NFIB, another business organization. A few more newspapers are suspect of this that aren't necessarily right-wing newspapers. I think you got 6.
Yeah. Okay, we come from money to prisons. And this is an interesting one to me.
Yeah.
This originally was put on the ballot. The idea came from the reparations package that was put together by the reparations task force on recommendations for legislation. And this was one of them. We have in our Constitution an anti-slavery provision, and they recommended this as an extension of that. And that's why it's on the ballot, because we have to change the Constitution to include this. Essentially prevents the Department of Corrections from demanding that prisoners do work. Prisoners do a lot of work, whether it's, cleaning up the place or improving things around, firefighting. California makes us incarcerated people do a lot of work and they don't pay them, or sometimes pay them next to nothing, like $1 an hour or something crazy. So this is being pushed by the justice reform people that say that's just a bad idea. They shouldn't be spending their time doing that. They should be spending their time rehabilitating themselves. So they came up with this. Nobody knows how much it's going to cost. There was a bill to do this earlier that the governor vetoed last time because it would require them to have paid the minimum wage for this kind of work. And that cost would have been astronomical because there's a lot of work involved. So that got vetoed. So they came up with this. I'm going to get this right, please. No, I'm not. So there's a couple of provisions in this. It's not very long, but it's interesting enough that make sure that instead of not working, that there's actual rehabilitation programs in place. They also say that, that a lot of times they have these programs in place already, but they're taken away to do work, and they'd rather spend the time they're spending there doing this kind of rehabilitation instead of physical work. There's been a lot of studies that saying the more you have rehab and less working, it's better for your outcome when you're released from prison. There is no formal opposition. If you look in the book, it's a blank page. Yet it's polling at 50-50. So imagine if there was money put into this. Right now, there's a yes campaign. It's not very well funded, but it's getting a lot of exposure in the newspapers and read about it. This is one you really should spend a little time reading the ballot argument about to see if it's something you're in favor of. There's critics that say it's good and bad. There's tough on crime. People aren't too crazy about this, understandably. They think people should be in prison and really not have the opportunity to do anything except pay the price for what they've done. So it's a little dicey that way. Supporters are who you might think: Democratic Party, ACLU, which fights for these kind of things, the League of Women Voters, the B, naturally, the Black Caucus in the legislature, and most of the labor unions in the state. The opponents are, again, who you might think. It's the California Republican Party, taxpayer organizations who thinks it might eventually cost the state money, and some of the right-leaning newspapers in the state.
Okay, now you may wonder, why are we jumping from Prop 6 all the way to Prop 32? Is anyone wondering?
I'm wondering.
Okay. So the legislature, the measures we just went through, the 5 we just went through, are the 5 that the legislature places on the ballot. So when they place a measure on the ballot, they're also, as part of that legislative action, decide what number to give to the measure. And if they give it the lower number, it appears on the ballot first. And there's a theory that probably is sound, but ultimately not really tested or proven, that, if people go down that ballot, if they get going into like a no, 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 no rhythm, they keep that rhythm going by the time they get to the end of it. And everything the legislature puts on, they want yes, yes, yes. So that's why we go from Prop 1 was in March. So now we've had 2 through 6 here in November. And now we're back to the last 5 measures are what were qualified through signature collection and are in an ongoing numerical cycle that will probably turn over again in about a decade, that the Secretary of State controls and assigns to these measures. So there it is. Maybe you can find someone around a dinner table that you can have fun with that trivia about. Good luck with that. So Prop 32, interesting. This is a measure that's been qualified for a while to raise the minimum wage. It's bankrolled by one individual. We'll show you that in a minute. This would bring the wage up, as you see, from the current 16 to 17 and then 18. It just barely missed that deadline in 22. That's originally what the proponents intended, but then it qualified after that, and they decided not to pull it back. They've left it on. California would have the highest minimum wage in the United States, and the LAO, of course, estimates the state and local costs could go up. Well, I say or down. I'd be curious how they go down.
Because more people are affording things and not dependent on
state on welfare.
Yep.
Arguments from the proponents: Californians need a raid. There's 2 million people that are working basically on minimum wage. They say this has the largest impact on people like single moms and others that are most in need and most underserved. They say, look, there's no studies that show any significant job loss when you increase the minimum wage this much, and that we need to be commensurate with rising costs that are affecting people's lives out there as well. The arguments against, of course, it's like, well, the business community is going to argue this will kill jobs. It'll add to inflation as additional labor costs typically get passed along in prices. Some say it's out of date. As you may know, the fast food industry has already had imposed on it a $20 minimum wage just for fast food, no other industry. So that has also, though, brought up wages with a lot of that type of service level industries. So some people argue like, well, we're already paying typically over this in a lot of businesses that this would apply to. The state has a past minimum wage law on the books that's adjusted for inflation. And then the point I already made about fast food has already been affected. So Joe Sandberg is the millionaire, he's probably a billionaire, that qualified this measure, again, with the intent of the 2022 ballot, not surprisingly supported by Democrat Party and the Cal Labor Fed. The no arguments is who you would expect, people that are going to pay the higher wage, from restaurants to grocery stores to small businesses, and of course the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association reliably on their opposing as well. And we mentioned about polling. What's interesting about this is there's not a lot of money either way on this, and it's not polling well. And you go back and look at the press coverage and the kind of the reporting on the impact of when the fast food minimum wage went all the way from 16 to $20. The coverage on that had more to do with the inflationary impact. Now, whether there's a debate going on, a year into it or 6 months into it, what kind of impact it's having out there. But there's a sense of voters coming out of inflation that we got to keep an eye on these wage issues. At least that's what the polling is suggesting.
Okay, deja vu. Prop 33. It's been on the ballot twice before, rejected by voters twice before, by significant margins. And yet, here it is again. So this time and every time they tweak it a little bit. And full disclosure, I worked against this the previous 2 times. I'm not working on it this time. But this would basically allow cities to impose real live rent control on properties, not just apartment buildings, but for the first time, single family homes. So if you have a single family home, right now it's exempt from most rent control in most cities. Now it would be under rent control. And it also would prevent the state from doing anything again to limit the ability for cities to impose rent control. The LAO looked at this with their calculator and said it's going to cost millions of dollars, tens of millions actually, because it's going to lower the value of a lot of homes that now are being rented out. So less tax revenue means bad things for a lot of cities, so they weren't too excited about that. There was a law passed in 1995, I believe. It's called Costa-Hawkins, again for the
Somewhere in there,
trivia. Yeah. And this prevented cities and counties from enacting rent control on new construction and new apartment buildings. And the other thing this one does, again, new, is that if somebody moves out, say you've been living in an apartment for 20 years, you've been regulated in a lot of cities, but you move out, the landlord can't increase the rent on that by any more, well, probably less than 5% of what that person who moved out is paying. So if I'm a landlord and I want to, after 25 years, somebody live in the place and I wanted to fix it up and everything, I cannot increase the price of rent for the new tenant coming in. Okay, so the reasons for this are obvious. The rent is too damn high, they say, and it is. Rent is out of control in a lot of places. This is a way to protect people from being able to live where they are living. There's a strong argument for that. If you look at the number here, a lot of people are paying a huge part of what they get for their rent just to keep a roof over their head. The arguments are very strong among tenant organizations. And frankly, if you have a low rent, this is a great deal for you because it means your landlord won't be able to raise the rent by more than a few percent every year. But if you ever want to move out of that place and look for another apartment, not such a good deal because it's going to cost you more. I'm hoping by the end of this, I get this right. Okay. So the arguments against this are are a little more sophisticated, I say. The first reason, the spear of this, and we'll talk about this in a second on to 34, is the AIDS Health Foundation. This is a nonprofit based in Los Angeles, run by a guy who has put 3 or 4 other initiatives on the ballot over the years, requiring condoms for porn stars. There's, I think, a drug control measure that he sponsored. The guy loves politics and loves to spend money on politics and uses it from his nonprofit to spend money on politics. So he's funding this again. He also owns, the organization owns a lot of tenants, a lot of apartments in Los Angeles. I mean lots. And they're usually low rent apartments. The LA Times did this big expose about what a slumlord he was, multiple lawsuits, elevators not working, rats, the whole 9 yards, like the worst landlord is trying to impose rent control. So the opponents of this use that very heavily. You'll probably seen it in the ads already. We talked about the family homeowners, the hit the homes will take. And the other new wrinkle this year is the governor signed a law that was passed during COVID when a lot of people were being pushed out of their homes for rent increases that limits rent statewide to 5% plus inflation. So the opponent's saying, why do we need this? We've already got the law. Okay, we talked about who's sponsoring that. The almost exclusive funder of this is that AIDS Health Foundation. And we'll talk about why they're able to do this in a second. The California Democratic Party has a very strong progressive wing, and therefore it, a number of others, liberal organizations, as you might expect. It's just,
Yeah.
I think I'm wired not to do that. And the opponents are, guess who? The landlords, the California Apartment Association, which is probably going to spend $20 to $30 million to try to kill us for the 3rd time. But then you have some unusual suspects here. You've got the governor, and you've got Tony Atkins, who was the Senate president, was about as liberal as you can get. The Sacramento Bee actually came out against this, which surprised me. The Chronicle, which is a more liberal paper. And then our friends at YIMBY are also against this because they think if there's rent control, then it doesn't pan out to build new apartments because there's a very top limit on what you're going to be able to charge for rent. I actually got it right. No? I had a brief moment of okay, so this is the weirdest one on the ballot by far because it affects one entity. The people who put Prop 33 on the ballot, the AIDS Health Foundation. Now, as I tried to explain, AIDS Health Foundation is a nonprofit that gets a lot of money from Medi-Cal. They take the drugs, and hence the name, and resell them. And that profit is what they bank as a nonprofit. And so it's unrestricted what they can do with that, as long as it's not candidate political spending. So you have this program that gives an entity this money to take it, and they charge health plans, and all that's well and good. It's a federal thing, a lot of complicated reasons for doing that. But again, there's really, the restrictions on political activity are pretty limited. I'm going to get this right. Okay, so this was put on the ballot by, guess who? The landlords, who were sick of this rent control thing coming up again, and again. So they decided, we're going to get this guy. We're going to make it so tough to spend that money that we're going to put it in the state constitution. All right, so they have sort of this other argument that, you know, with a wink and a blink, they're saying, well, it stops financial abuse and make sure the money that should go to patients actually is going to patients. It's going to make the Medi-Cal program work better. That's the on the face argument.
That's the ads that you're
That's the
seeing.
ads.
Yeah.
Okay, so as you might expect, the targeted group is not too excited about being targeted, and they call this the revenge initiative. Their argument is that we can do whatever we want with our money and stop trying to single us out. They say it's unconstitutional because it says something like, you can't do this to one organization. And they may be right about that. I'm sure this will be tested if it passes. And the other thing is like, hands off, let us do what we want. This is our mission. Let us spend our money the way we want to.
Just a quick comment on this. So this has been going on for a while. The Healthcare Foundation, Michael Weinstein, the slumlord, as he has been described by some, they do this in other states as well. They had a big measure in Ohio and caused a big fight there. Interesting thing. Well, where did this AIDS Healthcare Foundation even originate? I forget the exact merger, but this was created having to do with a merger that took place or divestment that took place in the healthcare space. So it was money that was divested out of private healthcare providers to go towards the purpose of providing healthcare. And I think I don't think anyone's probably spent more on ballot qualification, though, in the last several election cycles than that organization.
Yeah. This guy has a lot of enemies. Trust me. Okay. The supporters are these folks, but it's largely the apartment association and the allies that they've collected who don't want to see rent control. Oddly enough, the firefighters are on there. Why they're involved in this is kind of beyond me, but they're affiliated with a lot of the liberal groups that might not like this, but the Democratic Party is a no on this. I'll get to that here in a second. I'm sorry, I didn't put Democratic Party on there, but they oppose this too. And obviously a lot of newspapers who think this is just bad public policy.
Okay. More complicated healthcare issues. Prop 35. Prop 35 takes this existing tax on HMOs called the MCO tax. So the thing about the MCO tax. So this is a tax on health plans, on insurers, that the insurers typically support. And you say, well, why would they support a tax upon themselves? Well, it's because the revenue that they pay in out of their pocket then gets matched for Medicaid, or in California, Medi-Cal funding coming back. And most of these plans have large Medi-Cal businesses. So they're basically putting money in that they essentially get back, that almost makes them whole, at least on their Medi-Cal business, from the federal government. So it triggers federal money, and then that money typically goes out to help with provider rates to pay the doctors and the hospitals that do Medi-Cal. So this MCO tax comes up every so often, and it's always been like Republicans are under pressure usually from the business community to vote for it. And they're like, I don't want to vote for a tax. I mean, someone like Steve or Rob will do a hit piece on me someday and just say I voted for a tax on healthcare, and they're right. So it's always one of these goofy issues that comes up in the legislature. It's been reauthorized. It's set to expire in 2026. You can see there, it brings in a lot of money, $7 to $8 billion a year. Controversial this year because we have a budget deficit. And when that happens, governors go sweeping money out of all these special funds, this included. So he took money from this to go to the general fund to help with the deficit this year. So it would make the tax permanent, which the legislature is probably okay with because they don't have to keep voting for it because it can get complicated. But some legislators are upset they're not going to be able to say how then the money gets used, because this determines how the money will be used in perpetuity, which will be primarily to go to health providers. So who principally paid for this? The doctors, California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood, clinics are providers. So providers are doing this to try to cement money into the budget for them to continue to get increases in their rates. You can see the LAO there, say it's going to cost $2 billion, $5 billion. Again, this is complicated because it's paid by the health plans and the money is matched by the feds. By the way, this assumes that the feds will continue to have matching money. That may not be the case, particularly depending on the election outcome this year. Okay, arguments for 35, that the healthcare system needs this. We do have a crisis with providers, particularly in rural parts of the state. There being enough access for Medi-Cal patients. They don't want the state to redirect the money anymore, like I just indicated, and that this would protect future programs from any cuts. There was no formal argument against this, although the governor has spoken out against it publicly. He was opposed to it, but he did not have the bandwidth to organize any type of opposition campaign to it. And there was no one organized ballot arguments in time. There are some providers that feel like they would be negatively impacted that have voiced public opposition, but again, no formal campaign has been organized against it. Argument against it, and this is part of what they argue, and what some state legislators like Senator Minjavar have argued, is that it's ballot box budgeting, taking away the discretion of future legislatures to be able to make the decisions, pardon me, that they are elected to make. Yes, on 35, everyone that paid for it. Doctors, dentists, clinics. Opposition, as I said, nothing formal. The San Francisco Chronicle, though, continues their interesting march down the ballot with their endorsements, showing that they cannot be predicted. All right, the grand finale. So we've had bonds, we've had marriage, we've had complicated healthcare issues. We're going to close with some good old-fashioned crime. So Prop 36, which is, if you're aware of any initiative, it might be this, just because it's been in the news so much and it gets talked about a lot, although there's really no advertising for or against it. This is leading by such a wide margin that neither side's been able to raise any money for it. Well, not much money, I should say. So you will recall in the past decade, California went on a very progressive criminal justice reform kick. There was a couple ballot measures. Governor Brown led on those. Then Lieutenant Governor Newsom was certainly behind them. Then Attorney General Harris, interestingly, never took a position on any of them, which has been a topic lately. But this largely repeals Prop 47, which we passed a decade ago, that reduced theft and drug crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. So what this does is undo a lot of that, leading to more punishment around drugs, particularly fentanyl, and allowing prosecutors to be able to more effectively, they argue, go after serial shoplifters. So retail theft is a big focus of this. There's so much it does. We have a second slide on what it does. One thing as you read through it, though, I call your attention to is on the second bullet on the new treatment focused on the drug court process. So something that DAs and judges would talk about prior to Prop 47 was that in many counties, they set up what they felt were very successful drug courts. Sacramento County had one that was working very well. Judge Lori Brown ran that court. Some of you may know who Judge Brown is. And what it would do is, as long as you had the leverage of someone saying, well, you're going to go to jail, or you can enter into this rehabilitation interdiction and do that, and we can work some of your time off, or you can avoid imprisonment altogether. There was a lot, prosecutors felt like they were getting a lot of good progress with that. Well, 47 took away the ability to do that. So one of the things the DAs want to do is get back to this type of opportunity. Now, it might be in the opponent's arguments. What they're going to argue is that there's no money for that right now for those types of courts. So arguments for, it's like you would suspect, we're in a long cycle of the pendulum swinging towards increased crime and drug use, particularly the crisis with fentanyl. The legislature hasn't done anything to fix this. There was a late push. If you really pay attention to the press, there was a late push by the governor to try to get this off the ballot by passing some legislation that would impact these areas. However, The DAs of the state, the DA Association, who controlled the measure, because they were the authors of it, was unwilling to ultimately negotiate their measure off because of this quirk in California law that you can't amend a past proposition in the legislature unless it's a high threshold vote. You have to do it with another proposition. So the DAs have contended, no, we got to go to the voters in order to fix the things that they think need to be fixed. Arguments against those that have, on the progressive side, say we've made a lot of progress on not funding a war on drugs, that they argue over incarcerated the population. They think this now swings the other direction, could cost millions, if not billions, depending on what the increase of the population in prison or jails may be. What the legislature was trying to do would be sufficient, and should we just live with that? Advocates for minority communities say they are most impacted. And they claim this will take money from rehabilitation and mental health programs in communities, probably to fund things like the drug courts. Who's for this? I've been talking about the DAs. That's who's organized this. The association has. The funding from it came from large retailers, particularly Walmart Corporation. The finally one sees something being done about retail theft. Our local DA is on board, of course. Small Business Association, no surprise, California Republican Party. Local State Senator Angelique Ashby's on board. San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan, this is interesting. So Mayor Mahan's someone to keep an eye on. So there's a committee, a campaign committee that the DAs have organized that hasn't been able to raise much money. That's the main proponent committee for Prop 36. And they have contended this is a bipartisan measure just by the fact that DAs in the state are made up of Democrats and Republicans. They contend it's bipartisan. Well, Mayor Mahan's is a Democrat, and he wanted to come out in support of it, but he wanted to alter the message a little bit to emphasize more what this will do on rehabilitation and drug courts. And so he organized with some other Democrats and formed their whole separate committee. And they've been out there campaigning with a second committee, not participating with the DA's committee. So it's a little bit of it doesn't matter to voters, but it's a nuance that those of us in the political world watch. And it also shows the difference between how legislators are largely reacting to this, although Senator Ashby's on board, as opposed to mayors up and down the state overwhelmingly largely being in support of it.
Just one note on the money. The money for this came from retailers, Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot. And they largely have walked away from this because they got what they wanted in the legislative package. But the press around this was so substantial that they don't need the money. And that's why the people that were trying to negotiate this didn't really understand that they weren't holding many cards. They could really negotiate when something like this was polling at 75%. Also interesting is the tap dance of a lot of politicians, as Rob mentioned. Kamala Harris took a walk on this. Rob Bonta has taken a walk on this. Most of the constitutional office candidates for governor are taking a walk on this because they see how popular it is, but they don't want to offend the people in the Democratic Party who are largely against it. I think the contributors in No Campaign have been SEIU and a lot of the progressive organizations. So it's a very difficult tightrope for a lot of Democratic legislators to walk.
So as Steve indicated, the polling on this is anywhere from the 70s and PPIC to low 60s and some other polling. I can tell you in polling I'm seeing from all around the state, Steve's probably seeing the same thing, like in every district or in every city, including San Francisco, this is passing overwhelmingly. In other parts of the state, like in LA, the progressive district attorney is behind. He's about to lose. You may have the progressive district attorney in Alameda recalled. So that, these pendulums swing. If you've lived in the state for a while, you've seen us go all the way in the 90s from 3 strikes to where we were in the mid-teens. And now is it moving back a little bit, not all the way to 3 strikes, certainly, but these pendulums typically swing over time. Interesting thing about Governor Newsom, who had, I think, I think I say this without being partisan, had a bit of egg on his face when he couldn't get the legislative package through that he was trying to push, and then kind of abandoned it at the last minute, upset some legislators. And he was quoted as saying after the PPIC poll came out showing 70, I think about 72%, that he just doesn't recognize his state anymore.
Maybe if he spent some time in it.
Well, there's some of us thought that might have been one of the best cell phones ever by a governor. It's like, I don't recognize this state that wants to do this. So interesting. And there's a little money that's come in now from wealthy progressives who have done criminal justice reform, but it would take $50 million at this point. It's almost too late to try to beat this thing.
Made this a
Well,
little
I hope we
easier. But thank you very much. We might have
Thanks, all.
time for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and Rob. This is wonderful as always. We really appreciate your time. As Barbara pointed out in her introduction, we are just so fortunate to have people of your quality come here to present these measures. Many of them are confusing. I know I still have to study my ballot pamphlet, but we thank you very, very much for being here.